Yeah, look, there's a reason why this war hasn't ended, and that is because there's complex factors at play. I know that sounds like a throwaway line, but it's true. What we have tried to do in this entire process, and let's be clear about this. I mean, the United States is engaged in this. The president says this, and I'll translate what I think he's trying to say to you in all of this, and I think he's been pretty clear about it, is it's not our war. It's a war in another continent. We have equities, we have engagement in this war, but it's not our war per se. But we have been told by everybody, I think everybody would agree, that there's only one nation on earth, there's only one entity on earth that can actually talk to both sides and figure out whether there's a way to end this war peacefully, and that's the United States. And we've invested a lot of time, a lot of energy at the highest levels of our government. I believe, President Trump has had more meetings with foreign leaders and others on the war in Ukraine than on any other subject, including trade. He's invested a lot of time. Steve and Jared have invested time. I've invested time. The vice president, the Secretary of War.
Listen to me and listen closely, because what you just heard from Marco Rubio is the crystallization of a moral catastrophe that should make every single person with a functioning conscience feel like they're witnessing American imperialism wearing a mask of feigned helplessness. And here's the thing, that should absolutely infuriate you to your core, because Rubio literally said the United States is investigating what can Ukraine live with and what can Russia live with to drive them towards each other to some agreement, which means in the plainest possible terms that Washington has appointed itself the supreme arbiter of Ukrainian sovereignty, while simultaneously washing its hands of responsibility by insisting this brutal invasion is somehow not America's problem, even though the United States has been helping Ukraine for the past 3 years and has poured billions upon billions of dollars into this conflict. But now when the moral stakes become inconvenient, when the requirements of actual solidarity demand something more than performative outrage, suddenly it becomes a war on another continent that we can just walk away from, and this duplicity, this absolutely staggering intellectual dishonesty, represents everything that progressives have been warning about for decades regarding American foreign policy, because this is not about principle, this is about power, the grotesque manipulation of geopolitical chess pieces, while real human beings are dying in Kharkiv and Mariupol and across the blood-soaked territories of eastern Ukraine. And here's where this gets even more nauseating, because Trump's 28-point plan for peace in Ukraine would force Kyiv to give up additional territory in the East Cap the size of its military and agree it will never join NATO, and the Trump administration is ready to recognize Russian control of Crimea as part of the proposals, which means that what Rubio is actually describing when he talks about these complex negotiations is the wholesale dismemberment of Ukrainian territorial integrity and the ratification of Russian conquest through the polite language of diplomacy, and yet he has the audacity, the sheer unmitigated gall to stand there and say it's not our war, as if America exists in some kind of geopolitical vacuum, as if the global architecture of security and sovereignty and international law doesn't matter, as if Putin's revanchist imperialism won't embolden every authoritarian regime from Beijing to Tehran to Pyongyang. And this is precisely the kind of isolationist myopia dressed up as realism that enabled the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s when Western democracies decided that Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland wasn't worth fighting for, when Chamberlain came back from Munich waving that pathetic piece of paper promising peace in our time, and we know how that story ended, don't we? Now I want you to understand the deeper ideological rot at work here, because what Rubio is articulating represents a bipartisan consensus among American elites that has been building for years. It crosses traditional partisan lines in ways that should terrify anyone who believes in genuine international solidarity, because Rubio has come to believe that a negotiated settlement between Russia and Ukraine is the only realistic way to end the war, and he voted against the $95 billion in U.S. aid to Ukraine in April 2024, but voted in favor of aid to Ukraine in May 2022, which tells you everything you need to know about the cynical political calculations driving these decisions, because when it was politically expedient, when images of Russian tanks rolling toward Kyiv generated maximum outrage and maximum domestic political capital, then yes, absolutely send the aid, send the javelins, send the HIMARS systems, but now that the war has dragged on, now that the American public's attention has drifted toward other crises, now that supporting Ukraine requires sustained moral commitment rather than performative gestures, suddenly the calculation changes and only 28% of Republicans back additional funding compared to 62% of Democrats, and this represents not just a partisan divide but a fundamental abdication of the principles that supposedly animate American foreign policy. But wait, because it gets worse, and I need you to stay with me here, because Rubio said Friday that the U.S. may move on from trying to secure a Russia-Ukraine peace deal if there is no progress in the coming days after months of efforts have failed to bring an end to the fighting. And Rubio said it's not our war, which means the United States is now threatening to abandon Ukraine entirely, unless Zelensky agrees to whatever terms Washington and Moscow cook up between them. And this is emotional blackmail on a geopolitical scale. This is the diplomatic equivalent of holding a gun
Head of a democracy under siege.
and saying either you accept the partition of your country, or we walk away and let Putin finish the job. And the historical precedent here is absolutely chilling, because this is exactly what great powers have always done to smaller nations throughout history, from the Congress of Vienna to Yalta, to the Dayton Accords, where powerful countries sit around tables and redraw maps and divide territories and decide the fates of millions of people who never get a seat at the table, who never get consulted about whether they want to live under occupation, whether they want to surrender their sovereignty, whether they want to accept the boot of authoritarian rule on their necks forever. And here's where the progressive critique becomes absolutely essential, because what we're witnessing is not just a betrayal of Ukraine, what we're witnessing is the exposure of the fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of liberal internationalism, because for decades the United States has justified its global military presence, its 900-plus military bases scattered across the planet, its trillion-dollar defense budgets, its endless interventions in sovereign nations by claiming to defend democracy and freedom and the rules-based international order. But the moment that actually defending those principles requires sustained commitment, the moment it threatens to inconvenience American domestic politics or complicate America's great power competition with China, suddenly all those lofty ideals evaporate like morning dew, and we're left with the cold, hard realpolitik calculation that Ukraine just isn't worth the trouble, and the United States and the taxpayer money should be spent in furtherance of our foreign policy, as Rubio put it, which reveals the transactional mercenary logic undergirding the entire enterprise, because sovereignty apparently only matters when it serves American interests. Now let me be absolutely clear about something, because I know the reflexive response from certain quarters of the left will be to say, well, America shouldn't be involved at all. This is just more imperialism, more military-industrial complex profiteering, more endless war, and I understand that impulse, I genuinely do, because the progressive movement has been forged in opposition to exactly those kinds of interventions, from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, and we have been right to oppose those wars of choice, those illegal invasions, those catastrophic exercises in regime change that left hundreds of thousands dead and entire regions destabilized, but, and this is crucial, Ukraine is categorically different because even many critics of the United States, massive arms transfers to countries around the world, argue that a democratic nation faced with a full-scale invasion justifies military aid, and this isn't about American empire, this isn't about projecting power, this is about a sovereign nation invaded in flagrant violation of international law by a revanchist autocracy seeking to erase that nation's very existence, and the fact that some on the left have struggled to articulate support for Ukrainian self-defense because it might seem to align them with NATO or with American military policy represents a catastrophic failure of moral imagination, because here's what's actually happening right now as we speak, and this should make your blood boil. Russia launched a missile attack on Ukraine overnight, hitting a residential neighborhood of the city of Kharkiv. The strike killed one person and wounded 67 others, authorities said Friday, adding they feared more people could be trapped beneath the rubble of a damaged apartment building. And this is happening every single day while Rubio and Trump and their envoys conduct their genteel negotiations about what can Ukraine live with. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Sunday that in the last week Russia had used nearly 1,400 attack drones, 1,100 guided aerial bombs, and 66 missiles in attacks. Which means that while Washington debates and deliberates and threatens to move on, Russian bombs are falling on apartment buildings, on hospitals, on schools, on infrastructure, on the bodies of Ukrainian civilians who never asked for this war, who simply wanted to live in peace in their own country, oriented toward Europe, toward democracy, toward a future that Putin found intolerable because it threatened his corrupt authoritarian model. And the minerals deal, oh, don't even get me started on the minerals deal, because the comments came as the US and Ukraine are nearing a long-delayed deal granting the US access to Ukraine's vast mineral resources, which has been intertwined with President Donald Trump's peace push. Trump said Thursday, "We have a minerals deal," which exposes the entire cynical logic of this supposedly humanitarian intervention, because what we're really talking about is Ukraine's vast deposits of lithium and rare earth elements and other critical minerals that America needs for its green energy transition and its technology sector, and suddenly the peace negotiations start to look less like Wilsonian idealism and more like old-fashioned resource extraction, where a desperate nation under siege is forced to mortgage its natural wealth in exchange for the weapons it needs to survive, and this is neo-colonialism with a 21st century face. This is disaster capitalism operating in real time, where corporate interests and geopolitical strategy converge to strip mine a country's sovereignty under the guise of providing security assistance. Now let's talk about what Rubio actually revealed in that clip, because when he said there's only one entity on Earth that can actually talk to both sides and figure out whether there's a way to end this war peacefully, and that's the United States, he's articulating a vision of American exceptionalism that is breathtaking in its arrogance, because what he's really saying is that the United States and the United States alone possesses the wisdom and the power and the moral authority to determine the fate of Ukraine, and by extension the entire European security architecture. And this is imperialism, this is hegemony, this is exactly the kind of great power chauvinism that progressives should be denouncing from the rooftops, because it denies Ukraine agency, it denies Ukrainian people the right to determine their own future, it treats them as objects rather than subjects of history, and the fact that this is being done in the name of peace, in the name of preventing further bloodshed, in the name of pragmatic realism, makes it even more insidious, because it wraps domination in the language of humanitarian concern. And here's the kicker, here's what should absolutely enrage you. U.S. administration officials signaled Monday a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine may be closer than ever. We believe that we probably solved 90%, literally 90% of the issues between Ukraine and Russia. A U.S. official also said it would be up to Ukraine to decide how to handle the territorial issue, but the official also said the rest of the U.S. offer, including the strongest security guarantees put forward to date, will not be on the table forever, which is diplomatic blackmail, which is holding Ukraine hostage, which is saying either you accept the terms we've negotiated with your invader, or we withdraw our support and let you face annihilation alone, and the security guarantees they're offering. This NATO-like Article 5 guarantee is something that President Trump believes he can get Russia to accept. Ukraine is likely not going to push to join NATO, which the official added is a critical element in getting Russia's sign-off, which means the entire framework is premised on giving Putin what he wants, on ratifying his veto over Ukrainian foreign policy choices, on establishing a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe that Western leaders claim to oppose. Let me connect this to the broader trajectory of American foreign policy under both parties, because what we're witnessing is the culmination of a bipartisan pivot toward great power competition, where everything gets subordinated to the overriding imperative of countering China. And Russia is an acute problem, and it's a present-day challenge, but it's a 5-year or 10-year problem. China is a 100-year problem, Rubio observed in 2022, which reveals the strategic calculation at work here, because if you believe that the primary threat to American hegemony comes from Beijing, then Ukraine becomes expendable, becomes a distraction, becomes something to be resolved quickly and efficiently, so that Washington can redirect its resources and attention toward the Indo-Pacific. And this is exactly the kind of cold-blooded realpolitik that treats entire nations as pawns in a larger game where Ukrainian lives, and Ukrainian sovereignty, and Ukrainian democracy matter only insofar as they serve American strategic interests, and the moment they become inconvenient, they get sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical expediency. And congressional Republicans have been absolutely divided on this, because Republican support for Ukraine has been a steady refrain as lawmakers consider the Pentagon's $832 billion base spending request for 2026, and a rare point of contention on defense between the GOP-controlled legislature and White House. And the House Appropriations Committee's draft defense spending bill does not include funding for Ukraine aid, which means that even as Trump and Rubio conduct their negotiations, there's no guarantee that Congress will appropriate the funds necessary to implement whatever deal they reach. And this legislative dysfunction, this inability to sustain a coherent foreign policy, reflects the deeper crisis of American democracy, where short-term political calculations and partisan warfare make it impossible to maintain consistent commitments to anything, including the defense of democracy abroad, which is deeply ironic, given all the rhetoric about defending democratic values. But here's where it gets truly Orwellian, because during 2025, the Trump administration has sought to pressure Ukraine with the prospect of withholding U.S. intelligence support. The NDAA creates strict new reporting requirements to discourage any such moves. As recently as November, the White House said that unless Kiev agreed to a new U.S. proposal to end the war, it would stop sending weapons and providing the intelligence Ukraine uses in its defense, including to detect Russian air raids, which means the United States has been threatening to blind Ukraine's air defenses, threatening to prevent them from detecting incoming Russian missiles, threatening to let Ukrainian civilians die in attacks that could have been prevented unless Zelensky agrees to Washington's demands. And if that isn't blackmail, If that isn't coercion, if that isn't the use of military leverage to extract political concessions, then I don't know what is. And the fact that Congress had to pass legislation specifically to prevent the administration from cutting off intelligence sharing tells you everything about how willing Trump's team is to use Ukrainian lives as bargaining chips. Now I want to address the argument that negotiations are necessary, that continued fighting will only lead to more death and destruction, that Ukraine should accept territorial losses in exchange for peace, because this is the argument we're going to hear over and over from the realist foreign policy establishment, and it has a superficial plausibility, but it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of this conflict, because Putin's war aims are not limited to territorial conquest. Putin's goal, as he has articulated repeatedly, is the elimination of Ukrainian statehood, the denial of Ukrainian national identity, the reabsorption of Ukraine into a Russian sphere of domination, and there is no indication that Russia will accept any proposal that falls short of that, as Kiev reiterates its red lines in negotiation. No restrictions on alliances or military, and no recognition of Russian occupation. It is clear that these directly clash with Russia's goals: annexation of territories, barring Ukraine's path to NATO, and weakening its ability to defend itself, which means any peace deal negotiated on Putin's terms will not be peace. It will be a temporary ceasefire that allows Russia to consolidate its gains, rebuild its forces, and launch the next phase of conquest. And this brings me to what I think is the most important point, the most devastating indictment of what Rubio said, because when American officials talk about ending the war, what they actually mean is freezing the conflict along current lines, ratifying Russian territorial gains, denying Ukraine the weapons it needs to actually win, and then claiming that this represents a triumph of diplomacy over militarism. But to make Russia change its position, it needs to experience serious and prolonged setbacks, or perhaps lose the support of key allies. The Trump administration has failed to produce a coherent strategy for pressuring Russia into a deal. As long as Russia can sustain creeping battlefield advances, Putin has no incentive to negotiate based on the idea of freezing the front line and putting aside political differences, which means the entire diplomatic framework is built on quicksand, because Putin has no reason to accept a genuine peace when he believes time is on his side, when he thinks he can grind down Ukrainian resistance, when he calculates that American attention will drift and European resolve will crumble, and eventually he'll be able to take the rest of Ukraine anyway. So when Rubio says it's not our war, he's not just describing American disengagement, he's enabling Ukrainian destruction, because in a world where international security depends on collective defense, where sovereignty must be guaranteed by more powerful states, where small nations cannot stand alone against aggressive neighbors, American abandonment of Ukraine sends a signal to every autocrat on earth that conquest pays, that aggression works, that if you're willing to be brutal enough and patient enough, you can redraw borders by force, and the international community will eventually accept it, and this has implications far beyond Ukraine, because America's two most powerful adversaries have struck up a friendship without limits. If we fail to help Ukraine stop Russia in its tracks, there is every reason to believe Russia and China will both be emboldened, and suddenly Taiwan looks a lot more vulnerable, and suddenly the Baltics look a lot more exposed, and suddenly every territorial dispute from the South China Sea to the Caucasus becomes an invitation to aggression, because the lesson will have been learned that the West's commitment to sovereignty is negotiable, that America will cut deals with aggressors, that democracy is only worth defending when it's convenient. And let's be brutally honest about what's driving this, because it's not just strategic calculation, it's not just China competition, it's also domestic politics and war weariness, and the sense among American voters, particularly working-class voters, who have been hammered by decades of deindustrialization and austerity and wage stagnation, that we're spending billions of dollars on foreign conflicts while schools are crumbling and infrastructure is collapsing and healthcare is unaffordable, and that anger is completely legitimate, that frustration is entirely justified, but the solution is not to abandon Ukraine, the solution is to restructure American priorities so that we can defend democracy abroad while building a more just and equitable society at home, and this is where the progressive vision becomes essential, because we understand that militarism and inequality are connected, that endless war and domestic neglect flow from the same corrupted priorities, that what we need is not isolation but transformation, not withdrawal but a fundamentally different approach to American power, because here's what a genuinely progressive foreign policy would look like. Ukraine, it would start by providing Ukraine with everything it needs to defend itself, not in dribs and drabs, not with arbitrary restrictions on how weapons can be used, but with the full force of Western military-industrial capacity. It would mean imposing crushing sanctions on Russia's economy, not half measures, not exemptions for energy exports, but comprehensive sanctions that make Putin's war economically unsustainable. It would mean seizing Russian assets and using them to rebuild Ukraine. It would mean rallying a genuine international coalition, not through arm twisting and coercion, but through moral leadership, and it would mean offering Ukraine a genuine path to NATO membership and European integration, because security guarantees that can be revoked are not guarantees at all, and Ukraine agrees to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO, and NATO agrees to include in its statutes a provision that Ukraine will not be admitted in the future, according to the Trump plan, which permanently consigns Ukraine to a gray zone vulnerable to future Russian aggression. But more fundamentally, a progressive foreign policy would reject the entire framework of great power competition, would refuse to treat nations as pawns, would insist on Ukrainian agency and self-determination, would connect the fight against authoritarianism abroad with the fight against oligarchy and inequality at home, because the same corrupt forces that enable Putin's kleptocracy enable wealth concentration in America, the same fossil fuel interests that fund Russian aggression, fund climate denial in the West, the same authoritarian impulses that drive Putin's war, animate the far-right movements across Europe and America. And if we want to defeat Putinism, we need to understand it as part of a global phenomenon of authoritarian nationalism and oligarchic capitalism that transcends national boundaries. And if we're really going to confront the challenge that Putin represents, which is much bigger than just Putin, we need to understand the broader connections between corruption, oligarchy, and inequality, and change that approach. That's part of the progressive theory of the case in foreign policy. So when you hear Marco Rubio say it's not our war, understand what he's really saying. He's saying that Ukrainian lives don't matter enough. He's saying that international law can be violated with impunity. He's saying that America will betray its allies when supporting them becomes inconvenient. He's saying that sovereignty is conditional, that democracy is expendable, that the entire post-World War II architecture of collective security and human rights and self-determination was just a facade that can be discarded the moment it conflicts with narrow calculations of national interest, and this should be absolutely unacceptable to anyone who believes in justice, to anyone who believes in solidarity, to anyone who understands that the struggle for freedom is indivisible, that an attack on democracy anywhere is an attack on democracy everywhere, that we are all implicated in the crimes committed in our names and with our tax dollars, and under the banner of our supposed values. The tragedy here, the absolute heartbreaking tragedy, is that this didn't have to happen. This war could have been prevented if the West had been clearer about its commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty earlier, if NATO had offered membership when it might have deterred invasion, if Western leaders had imposed costs on Putin after Crimea, after the Donbass, after the downing of MH17, after the poisonings and the election interference, and all the other acts of aggression that were met with tepid sanctions and strongly worded statements. But instead we dithered and delayed, and hoped the problem would go away, and now hundreds of thousands are dead, and millions displaced, and an entire country devastated, and Rubio wants to wash his hands of it, wants to declare mission accomplished, wants to move on to other priorities, and Ukrainian mothers are still pulling their children's bodies from the rubble of apartment buildings destroyed by Russian missiles, and that blood, that innocent blood, is on our hands. It's on all of our hands, every time we allow our leaders to prioritize expedience over justice. Every time we accept their excuses, every time we fail to demand better, we become complicit in the horror, and we cannot let that stand. We cannot accept this betrayal. We must demand that America live up to its professed values. We must insist on genuine solidarity with Ukraine. We must fight for a foreign policy grounded in human rights and self-determination, and democratic solidarity rather than cynical realpolitik and great power competition. Because if we don't, then Rubio will be right, it won't be our war, and that will be the greatest moral failing of our generation.